The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew before I even answered that my life was about to shatter into pieces I'd never be able to put back together. "Sarah, you need to choose." My mother's voice was cold, clinical, nothing like the woman who used to sing me lullabies when I couldn't sleep. "It's him or us. You can't have both." Him. As if my 8-year-old son Michael was some kind of disease they could just cut out of our family tree. I'm Sarah Chen-Martinez, and 6 months ago, I was the golden daughter of Millbrook's most respected family. I had the perfect house on Maple Street, the perfect job at the church daycare, and everyone said I was handling widowhood with such grace after losing David in that car accident 3 years ago. My children, Michael and Emma, were the light of our tight-knit community's eyes. But that was before the diagnosis, before the word autism turned my beautiful boy into someone my own family wouldn't accept. The morning I walked into St. Mary's Community Center with Michael's official papers, I thought I was finally getting him the help he needed. Instead, I watched my mother's face drain of color as she read the words that would divide our family forever. My sister Jennifer actually took a step back, like Michael's condition was something she could catch. And my father just looked at me like I had personally failed him. "This is what happens when you don't discipline children properly," my mother whispered, loud enough for the other church ladies to hear. "In our day, we knew how to raise respectful kids." That's when I made the choice that changed everything. I didn't argue, I didn't try to educate them. I simply picked up my son, held him close, and walked away from the only family I'd ever known. What they don't know, what nobody in this judgmental, small-minded town bothered to ask, is that Michael didn't just develop autism. The accident that killed his father also gave him a traumatic brain injury that triggered his symptoms. My perfect little boy spent 3 months in a coma, and when he woke up, he was different. Not broken, just different. But here's the secret I've been carrying alone for 6 months. I have proof that could destroy the most powerful family in Millbrook. I have documents, recordings, evidence of things my own family has done that would shock this entire community. And now, as I sit here at midnight writing this story while my children sleep peacefully in the next room, I'm finally ready to tell the truth. Because tomorrow, I'm going to do something that will either set us free or destroy us completely. And I need you to understand why I have to do it. If you've ever had to choose between protecting your child and keeping your family, if you've ever stood alone against the world because love demanded it, then you need to hear this story. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the price of a mother's love. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew before I even answered that my life was about to shatter into pieces I'd never be able to put back together. The shrill ring cut through the darkness of my bedroom like a blade, and my heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the device with trembling fingers. "Sarah, you need to choose." My mother's voice was cold, clinical, nothing like the woman who used to sing me lullabies when I couldn't sleep. "It's him or us. You can't have both." Him. As if my 8-year-old son Michael was some kind of disease they could just cut out of our family tree. As if the boy who still asked me to check under his bed for monsters every night was somehow less worthy of love than the rest of us. I sat up in bed, my silk nightgown clinging to my sweat-dampened skin. The moonlight streaming through my bedroom window cast eerie shadows across the walls, and for a moment I felt like I was living in some twisted nightmare. But the harsh reality of my mother's words cut through any hope that this was just a bad dream. "Mom, it's almost 4 a.m. What are you talking about?" I whispered, though I knew exactly what she meant. The diagnosis had been hanging over our family like a storm cloud for weeks now, and I'd been waiting for this moment, the moment when they'd finally say what they'd been thinking all along. "Don't play dumb with me, Sarah. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That boy of yours, he's not normal. He's disruptive, he's embarrassing, and frankly, he's becoming a problem for all of us." The words hit me like physical blows. Each syllable felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. This was my mother, the woman who had raised me, who had taught me about unconditional love, who had held me when I cried over scraped knees and broken hearts, and now she was asking me to choose between my child and my family. "He's autistic, Mom. He's not a problem. He's my son." My voice cracked on the last word, and I could feel the tears starting to burn behind my eyes. "He's your grandson." "Not anymore." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, the screen's glow illuminating the wedding ring I still wore 3 years after David's death. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the soft sound of my own ragged breathing. In the next room, Michael was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that his grandmother had just erased him from existence with a single phone call. That's when I realized that the battle I'd been fighting for months, trying to get my family to accept Michael's diagnosis, trying to educate them about autism, trying to keep our family together, was over. I had lost before I'd even known I was at war. 6 months ago, I was the golden daughter of Millbrook's most respected family. I had the perfect house on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and rose garden, the perfect job at St. Mary's Church daycare, and everyone said I was handling widowhood with such grace after losing David in that car accident 3 years ago. My children, Michael and Emma, were the light of our tight-knit community's eyes. The Chen-Martinez family was Millbrook royalty. My father owned the largest construction company in town, employing nearly half the local workforce. My mother ran the church charity drives and organized every major community event. My sister Jennifer was married to the town's only pediatrician, and they lived in the sprawling colonial house that had been featured in Southern Living magazine. We were the family everyone looked up to, the family everyone wanted to be. Every Sunday after church, we'd gather at my parents' house for dinner. The long mahogany table would be set with my grandmother's china, and my mother would serve her famous pot roast, while my father carved the meat with ceremonial precision. Michael would sit between Emma and me, his small hands folded neatly in his lap as we said grace. He was such a good boy then, so quiet and well-behaved that the other mothers would comment on how lucky I was. "Sarah's children are just angels," Mrs. Henderson from the church would say, patting Michael's head as he stood silently by my side. "You can tell they come from good stock." Good stock. As if we were prize cattle being judged at the county fair. But I basked in the praise, proud of my beautiful, well-mannered children. I thought I was doing everything right. I thought I was the perfect mother, the perfect daughter, the perfect widow who had overcome tragedy with dignity and grace. The cracks started showing slowly. Michael began having what I called difficult days, moments when he would become overwhelmed in crowded places, when loud noises would send him into meltdowns, when he'd rock back and forth in his bedroom for hours. I told myself it was just a phase, that he was still processing his father's death, that he needed time to adjust. But the episodes became more frequent. At Emma's birthday party, Michael had a complete breakdown when the other children started singing "Happy Birthday." He covered his ears and screamed until I had to carry him to his room, leaving behind a crowd of confused parents and frightened children. The whispers started that day. "Something's not right with that boy," I heard Jennifer murmur to her husband as they cleaned up the scattered birthday decorations. "Sarah's been through so much," my mother replied, her voice thick with false sympathy. "Maybe she's just overwhelmed." They talked about us like we weren't there, like Michael's pain was somehow a reflection of my failure as a mother. The perfect family facade was crumbling, and I was the only one trying to hold it together. The morning I walked into St. Mary's Community Center with Michael's official papers, I thought I was finally getting him the help he needed. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, not because of the weight of the paper, but because of the weight of what those words would mean for our family. After months of appointments, evaluations, and sleepless nights, I finally had answers. Autism spectrum disorder. The words looked so clinical, so final, printed there in black and white. But to me, they represented hope. Hope that Michael's struggles had a name, that there were treatments and therapies that could help him, that we could finally stop wondering what was wrong and start focusing on what was right. I had called a family meeting at the community center because I wanted to do this properly. I wanted to educate them, to show them the pamphlets I'd collected, to explain what autism meant and how we could all work together to support Michael. I was naive enough to believe that knowledge would breed compassion, that understanding would bring us closer together. My parents arrived first, followed by Jennifer and her husband, Dr. Marcus. They sat in the circle of folding chairs like a tribunal, their faces already set in expressions of polite concern that didn't quite hide the judgment underneath. Michael was at home with Emma and Mrs. Rodriguez, our neighbor, blissfully unaware that his fate was being decided in a sterile community center room. "So," my father said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used in business meetings, "what did the doctors say?" I took a deep breath and pulled out the diagnosis papers, my hands trembling slightly as I spread them across the table. Michael has autism spectrum disorder. It's a neurological condition that affects how he processes sensory information and social interactions. The good news is that with proper support and therapy, he can... Autism. My mother's voice cut through my explanation like a whip. "You're telling me my grandson is... disabled?" The word hung in the air like a curse. I watched my mother's face drain of color as she read the words that would divide our family forever. My sister Jennifer actually took a step back, like Michael's condition was something she could catch. And my father? My father just looked at me like I had personally failed him. "This is what happens when you don't discipline children properly," my mother whispered, loud enough for the other church ladies who were setting up for their meeting to hear. "In our day, we knew how to raise respectful kids." That's when I made the choice that changed everything. I didn't argue. I didn't try to educate them. I simply picked up my son's diagnosis, held the papers close to my chest, and walked away from the only family I'd ever known. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your child and keeping your family? What they don't know, what nobody in this judgmental, small-minded town bothered to ask, is that Michael didn't just develop autism. The accident that killed his father also gave him a traumatic brain injury that triggered his symptoms. My perfect little boy spent 3 months in a coma, and when he woke up, he was different. Not broken, just different. The night David died, we were driving home from Michael's soccer game. It was raining, one of those sudden downpours that turns Texas roads into rivers. Michael had scored his first goal that day, and he was chattering excitedly in the back seat about how he couldn't wait to tell his daddy. Emma was asleep in her car seat, her small hand clutching the participation trophy she'd received for helping the team manager. "Did you see me, Daddy? Did you see me kick the ball?" Michael kept asking, his voice bright with pride and excitement. "I saw you, buddy. You were amazing," David replied, catching my eye in the rearview mirror and smiling. That was the last normal conversation we ever had as a family. The truck ran the red light at the intersection of Main and Cedar. I remember the headlights cutting through the rain like daggers, remember David shouting, "Hold on!" as he yanked the steering wheel to the right. The impact came from my side of the car, and the sound of metal crushing metal still echoes in my nightmares. David died instantly. The paramedics said he probably didn't feel any pain, that the trauma was too severe. But Michael was trapped in the back seat for 47 minutes while the fire department worked to cut him free. 47 minutes with his father's blood on his face, 47 minutes of sirens and screaming and chaos that no 5-year-old should ever have to endure. The doctor said it was a miracle that any of us survived. Emma had a few bruises and a broken arm. I had a concussion and 3 cracked ribs. But Michael had a traumatic brain injury that would change everything about who he was. For 3 months, I lived in that hospital room. I held his small hand and talked to him about soccer games and bedtime stories about how much his daddy loved him and how proud we were of his first goal. The nurses said that hearing familiar voices could help, that even though he was unconscious, he might be able to hear me. When he finally woke up, he was different. The chatter was gone. The easy smiles disappeared. The little boy who had once been so eager to please, so quick to laugh, was replaced by someone who seemed to be living in a world that was too bright, too loud, too overwhelming to bear. But my family never asked about the accident. They never asked about the brain injury or the trauma or the months of recovery. They just saw a child who was no longer convenient, no longer perfect, no longer worthy of their love. But here's the secret I've been carrying alone for 6 months. I have proof that could destroy the most powerful family in Millbrook. I have documents, recordings, evidence of things my own family has done that would shock this entire community. And now, as I sit here at midnight writing this story while my children sleep peacefully in the next room, I'm finally ready to tell the truth. The evidence came to me by accident, hidden in a box of David's belongings that my father-in-law had finally been able to go through. Mixed in with my husband's old business cards and construction schedules was a manila envelope marked Insurance Investigation Confidential. Inside were photographs, witness statements, and a mechanic's report that made my blood run cold. The truck that killed David and injured Michael didn't just run a red light. It was driven by Tommy Brennan, my father's business partner's son, who had been drinking at Murphy's bar for 3 hours before getting behind the wheel. The photographs showed the skid marks, the impact patterns, the beer cans scattered across the road from Tommy's truck. But here's what made my hands shake as I read through the police reports. My father had been at Murphy's bar that night, too. He had been drinking with Tommy, had watched his business partner's son get progressively more intoxicated, and had done nothing to stop him from driving home. In fact, according to the bartender's statement, my father had actually encouraged Tommy to leave, saying that his wife would be worried if he didn't get home soon. The mechanic's report was even more damning. Tommy's truck had been serviced at my father's shop just 2 weeks before the accident. The brake lines were worn, the tires were bald, and the headlights were misaligned. Any competent mechanic would have declared the vehicle unsafe to drive. But my father had signed off on the inspection, had given Tommy's death trap a clean bill of health. My father knew that truck was dangerous. He knew Tommy was drunk. He knew that sending him out on those rain-slicked roads was essentially loading a weapon and pointing it at innocent families. But he did it anyway, because Tommy's father owed him money, and dead men can't pay their debts. The cover-up went deeper than I had imagined. Phone records showed calls between my father and the police chief, between my mother and the district attorney's wife, between Jennifer and the hospital administrator. They had all worked together to bury the truth, to protect the Chen family name, to make sure that Tommy's drinking and my father's negligence never saw the light of day. They had been willing to sacrifice David's memory, to let his death be written off as a random accident, to protect their own reputation. And when Michael's brain injury started showing symptoms, when his behavior became inconvenient and embarrassing, they turned on him too. What would you do if you discovered your own family had covered up the truth about your husband's death? The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and painful realizations. Every family dinner I had attended, every holiday celebration, every moment of shared grief over David's death had been built on lies. My family hadn't just failed to protect David. They had actively participated in covering up the circumstances of his death. I started seeing everything differently. The way my father had insisted on handling David's funeral arrangements, claiming he wanted to spare me the burden. The way my mother had discouraged me from pursuing the insurance claim, saying it would be too painful to relive the accident. The way Jennifer had suggested I see a therapist, implying that my grief was somehow excessive or abnormal. They had all been managing me, controlling the narrative, making sure I never asked the right questions or looked too closely at the evidence. They had turned me into a puppet in their elaborate cover-up, and I had been too devastated by loss to see the strings. The recordings were the worst part. David's phone had been recovered from the accident scene, and somehow the insurance investigator had managed to retrieve the voicemails. There were messages from my father to David from the week before the accident, messages I had never heard before. "David, we need to talk about the Patterson contract. Meet me at Murphy's Tuesday night around 8, and bring those invoices I asked you to look at." My father's voice was casual, businesslike, completely normal. But I knew now that the Patterson contract was a lie, that there were no invoices, that my father had lured David to that bar for reasons I was still trying to understand. The second message was even more disturbing. David, I need you to keep quiet about what we discussed. Sarah doesn't need to know about this right now. Not with everything she's going through. It's better for everyone if we just let sleeping dogs lie. What had they discussed? What secret had my father been keeping from me? And why had David agreed to meet with him at Murphy's bar on the night Tommy Brennan was drinking himself into a murderous rage? I confronted my father on a Thursday evening, showing up at his office after hours. When I knew he'd be alone, the construction company headquarters was eerily quiet, with only the security lights casting long shadows across the empty desks and silent machinery. "We need to talk about David," I said, walking into his office without knocking. He looked up from his paperwork, his face immediately shuddering when he saw the manila envelope in my hands. "Sarah, what are you doing here? It's late, and you should be home with the children." "I found the insurance investigation files." I dropped the envelope on his desk, watching as his face went pale. "I know about Tommy. I know about the truck. I know about the cover-up." For a moment, he just stared at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father as he really was. Not the respected businessman, not the pillar of the community, but a frightened old man who had been living with the consequences of his choices for 3 years. "Sarah, you don't understand. There are things about that night, things that are more complicated than you realize." "Things that are more complicated?" I repeated, my voice rising with each word. "David is dead. My son has brain damage. My family has been lying to me for 3 years. What could possibly be more complicated than that?" My father stood up slowly, his hands pressed flat against his desk. In the harsh fluorescent light of the office, he looked older than his 62 years, his face etched with lines of guilt and exhaustion that I had never noticed before. "David knew about the money," he said quietly. "He knew about the missing funds from the Patterson account, and he was threatening to go to the police." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the chair across from his desk, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "What money?" "I borrowed from the client accounts, just temporarily, to cover some bad investments. I was going to pay it back, but the market crashed, and then the bank called in my loans and—" He trailed off, his voice breaking. "You stole money." It wasn't a question. I was going to pay it back. I had a plan, but David found out, and he said he couldn't be part of it. He said he had a family to think about, that he couldn't risk his reputation for me. The room was spinning. My husband, my loyal, honest husband, had discovered that his father-in-law was an embezzler, and instead of coming to me, instead of trusting me with the truth, he had arranged to meet with my father at Murphy's bar to discuss it. "So you killed him?" The words came out flat, emotionless. "No!" My father's denial was immediate and desperate. It wasn't like that. I was trying to convince him to give me more time, to let me find another way to replace the money. I never meant for anything to happen to him. "But you knew Tommy was drinking. You knew his truck was dangerous. You knew he was going to drive home that night." I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. "You let him get behind the wheel because you needed David to disappear." "Goodbye, Mom," I said, and hung up the phone. I knew what I had to do. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the evidence that could destroy my family, thinking about the choice I had to make. On one side was justice for David, vindication for Michael, and the truth that had been buried for 3 years. On the other side was the complete destruction of everything and everyone I had ever known. At 6 a.m., I made coffee and called in sick to work. I needed time to think, time to figure out how to move forward. But even as I went through the motions of a normal morning, making breakfast for the children, helping Michael with his medication, braiding Emma's hair, I knew that normal was gone forever. Michael seemed to sense my distress. He kept looking at me with those big, serious eyes, his head tilted slightly to one side in the way that always reminded me of David. Finally, he came over and put his small hand on my arm. "Mama sad?" he asked, his voice soft and uncertain. It was the first time he had asked me about my feelings since the accident. For months, he had been so wrapped up in his own struggles that he hadn't been able to reach out to anyone else. But now, somehow, he was offering me comfort. "Yes, baby," I said, gathering him into my arms. "Mama is sad, but I'm going to fix it, okay? I'm going to make things better." He nodded solemnly, then rested his head against my chest. We sat like that for a long time, just holding each other, and I realized that this was what love looked like. Not the conditional acceptance my parents had offered, not the fair-weather support of my extended family, but this quiet, steady presence that didn't need explanations or apologies. Emma found us there an hour later, and she climbed onto my lap too, wrapping her arms around both Michael and me. My children, who had lost their father and been rejected by their grandparents, were still capable of love. They were still capable of forgiveness. They were still capable of choosing family over convenience. That's when I made my decision. I called the police station and asked to speak with Detective Martinez, who had been the lead investigator on David's case. I told him I had new evidence about the accident, evidence that would change everything. He agreed to meet me at the station that afternoon. Then I called my lawyer, explaining that I needed to discuss some sensitive family matters. I scheduled an appointment for the next morning. Finally, I called my father. "Sarah, thank God! I've been up all night thinking about our conversation. Maybe we can work something out, find a way to—" "I'm going to the police today," I interrupted. "I'm going to tell them everything, about the money, about Tommy, about the cover-up, all of it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sarah, please, think about what this will do to your mother. Think about Jennifer's children. Think about all the innocent people who will be hurt by this." "I am thinking about innocent people," I said. "I'm thinking about David, who was murdered to protect your secret. I'm thinking about Michael, who was rejected by his family because his injuries were inconvenient. I'm thinking about my children, who deserve to know the truth about their father. What do you want? Money? I can liquidate some assets, pay for Michael's therapy, set up a trust fund for the children's education. We can make this right without destroying everything." "You can't buy your way out of this one, Dad. Some things are worth more than money." After I hung up, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of the secret was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since David died. I was finally going to do right by my husband and my son. The police station was exactly as I remembered it from 3 years ago, when I had first gone to file the accident report. The same fluorescent lights, the same beige walls, the same smell of coffee and disinfectant. But this time, I wasn't the grieving widow seeking answers. I was the woman who had found them. Detective Martinez was a kind man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much tragedy. He had been the one to tell me about David's death, the one who had held my hand while I identified the body, the one who had promised me that they would find out what happened. "Mrs. Chen-Martinez," he said, standing up as I entered his office, "I have to say I'm surprised to hear from you after all this time. You said you had new evidence?" I placed the manila envelope on his desk, my hand steady now that the moment had finally arrived. "I have everything. The real story about what happened that night, the cover-up, the people who were involved. For the next 2 hours, I laid out the entire truth. I showed him the insurance investigation, the mechanics report, the phone records, the voicemails. I told him about my father's embezzlement, about David's discovery of the theft, about the meeting at Murphy's bar. I told him about Tommy Brennan's drinking, about the unsafe truck, about the deliberate decision to let a drunk driver take the wheel. Detective Martinez listened without interruption, taking notes, asking pointed questions, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. Mrs. Chen-Martinez, if even half of this is true, we're looking at multiple felony charges: embezzlement, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, possibly even accessory to vehicular homicide. It's all true, I said quietly. Every word. The next few days were a whirlwind. Arrest warrants were issued. The local news picked up the story. The construction company was raided by federal investigators. My father was led away in handcuffs, and my mother collapsed at the church during Sunday service. Jennifer called me, screaming and crying, accusing me of destroying the family for revenge. The church ladies whispered about me in the grocery store. Former friends crossed the street to avoid me. Millbrook's golden family had fallen, and I was the one who had pushed them off their pedestal. But in the midst of all the chaos and condemnation, something beautiful happened. People began reaching out to me, other families dealing with autism, other widows who had faced judgment, other people who had been hurt by the powerful and well-connected. They saw my story not as betrayal, but as courage. Michael started therapy with a specialist who understood trauma-related autism. Emma began seeing a counselor who helped her process her father's death and her family's rejection. And I started sleeping through the night for the first time in 3 years. The trial is still months away, but I know that justice will be served. My father will go to prison. The families of other victims will get compensation. The truth will finally be told. As for Michael and Emma and me, we're building a new life. A life based on honesty instead of lies, on love instead of convenience, on chosen family instead of blood relations. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life we deserve. My children are thriving. Michael is learning to communicate in new ways, and Emma is discovering that she's stronger than she ever imagined. They've seen what happens when you choose truth over comfort, when you choose love over loyalty, when you choose justice over peace, and they've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to let the people who hurt you face the consequences of their choices. Tonight, as I tuck them into bed, Michael looks up at me with those serious eyes and says, "Mama, not sad anymore." He's right. I'm not sad anymore. I'm free. If this story has touched you, if you've ever had to choose between truth and family, between justice and peace, please know that you're not alone. Like this video if Sarah's journey resonated with you. Share your own story in the comments. We heal together when we speak our truth. And subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this that need to be told, more voices that need to be heard. Remember, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is to choose your children over your family, to choose truth over comfort, to choose love over loyalty. And sometimes setting yourself free means watching everything you once knew burn to the ground. You are not alone, you are not broken, and you are worthy of love that doesn't come with conditions.